Hello. So we're going to do one last video as part of this just to kind of have an idea of, all right, what does this look like for Monday morning? AKA, what's kind of a step-by-step process of how I have to think about my PACE lessons, how I have to plan them, and what I have to do in order to make them as successful as possible. So step one is you're going to decide, do I use PACE or do I not use PACE? I need this to be very, very clear that not every single grammar point can use PACE, and that's okay. We have other methods to draw their attention to these things. So the rule of thumb is there should be a clear, distinguishable rule that students can actually notice. So thinking about what can they put together. Preterite by itself, there's a lot of irregularities to the preterite. For them to be able to put together the preterite in a meaningful way where you're not just only using regular or only using irregular verbs, it's really hard. It doesn't really make sense to them. However, preterite versus imperfect, that's something that they can actually distinguish and figure out. Okay? So it all comes down to figuring out what will they notice and what is important. So make sure that the students are creating meaning with that text. And again, it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of approach. Here's my list of suggestions. Some of these are in French as well. So adjective agreements are easier places for them to kind of figure things out, believe it or not. Ser versus estar, saber versus conocer, those sorts of savoir and connaître for French teachers. Those are rules. They can figure out, I use ser when I do this. I use estar when I do this. Obviously, there's some complexities to it, but they can usually put together those rules. Passé composé for French teachers, their past tense is set up like our present perfect tense. That's noticeable. Past tense is preterite versus imperfect. They can notice when it's versus. They're very good at noticing something versus something else. Perfect tenses, subjunctive, and commands, depending on how you present the commands. If you do positive and negative commands together, you have to draw their attention specifically. So maybe just draw their attention to positive first and then look at negatives. Remember, it's going to be a rule. This is not going to be how you present every verb form for the rest of your life. Right? It has to make sure that it's a structure. It has to make sure that there's something that they can discover. So once you've decided that, your step two is to choose the appropriate resource. So choose whether you're going to write your own or look for an authentic resource. My rule of thumb, honestly, an hour or two at most looking for a resource, and then call it a day and write your own. You're going to save yourself so much more time, and they're not going to learn less because of it, right? So make sure the grammar point is present but not overbearing. Like I said, every sentence should not have the subjunctive. When it makes sense to use a subjunctive, it should be there. Every sentence should be a natural flow. So if you write your own story, you might want to have somebody else check and be like, does this sound like a person or does this sound like a teacher? You want to make sure that's very clear. And don't try to force an irregular verb just because you're like, oh, I really want to make sure that this verb is in there so they notice it. You can just tell them that verb. And if it doesn't make sense in your story, it's probably better to try a culturally appropriate expression. It's probably better to do some sort of cultural knowledge, a different vocabulary word. Those are way more important than trying to make sure you fit in every strange irregular verb that you want them to ever memorize. Step three, you're going to decide what are they going to do in part one. So you're going to make an interpretive task with the resource, thinking about pre, during, and post. So are they identifying words? Are they sequencing events? Are they doing true or false questions? I like to do it sometimes where it's true or false, find the evidence of why it's true, why it's false. Make sure you ask students, well, what's the purpose of this resource? Because above all, you want to make sure that they understand the main idea of the resource. And if they're intermediates, you want to make sure they understand some supporting details that go with the resource as well. So it's deciding in part two, what are they going to be doing? So ask students to continue doing more with the resource. So don't just read it and call it a day. Think of what else can happen. Can you do a short interpersonal conversation related to the theme of the resource? So maybe if you read something about straws, maybe you do a quick little debate, right? Where they're using that information from there to talk about content. They're not talking about grammar yet, okay? So you might need to use the resource to find sentence starters or maybe make a word bank for them. Maybe you want to have a short presentational writing activity where they're expressing their opinion on something, where they're continuing the story, where they're doing a cultural comparison. Maybe they're writing a letter to the character in the story, or they're writing a letter as the character in the story. Note that we're on step 4 and there has not been any grammar instruction at this point. We haven't drawn their attention to anything. We've just been working with resources. Now here it comes. So step 5, we're going to draw their attention to that grammar point. So you're going to redirect your students' attention. So before they were reading for comprehension, now they're reading for a different purpose, for a grammar purpose. Bold or color code, I can't say that enough. If you just tell them to go look for the words, they're going to notice things that you didn't even know were in the resource. You want to make sure you're saying, look at these specific words, look at these specific structures, okay? It's because you want your students to notice something about that resource that they hadn't necessarily noticed before, that they were able to just go through and be like, oh, I know what this says. I understand this resource. And now they're going, oh, I understood it, and I don't know what this is. I don't know how this is set up. From there, you're going to start your co-construction. So you're going to have students identify the patterns that they notice. They can be individual, small group, large group. I like to do it as the think, pair, share. Work by yourself, see what you notice. Then work with your partner because they notice sometimes things that you might have missed or vice versa. And then share out to the large group. I record all their observations on the board as sort of like a word splash. And I start to organize their thoughts a little bit, not a lot, not in the sense of like this is how it goes, but it's like, all right, you mentioned something about verb formation, let me put that over here. You notice something about when to use it, let me put that over here. Make sure you're always asking questions, not telling them, asking questions to get them to notice the grammar points. So that expression that I always use is, well, what do you notice when this happens? What happens here? What do you observe here? Again, I think this could be done in the target language. Some people make an argument for English. I think that it's worth trying in the target language. See what they can put together, because Laura Tyrrell phrases it perfectly as, if they can't necessarily explain it in the target language, it might not be a grammar point they're ready for. Okay, and that's just a little piece to keep in the back of your mind. So then step 7, you're going to decide, all right, explicit instruction yet or continued co-instruction? So maybe there's still more that I need them to get. Maybe I have them revisit and I draw their attention again to specific ones. But after I feel like I've gotten everything out of them, this is where I'll just explicitly tell them to fill in those knowledge gaps. Okay? Their brainstorm is the notes to guide my instruction. I don't have pre-written notes that I'm going to give them afterwards, because then they're just going to expect those. Their brainstorm becomes their notes. Okay? So some people love to use acronyms or mnemonic devices. If you're somebody that, if you think it's a useful thing, then maybe you have them create their own, instead of you saying, this is my version, this is what I learned in school, this is the one everybody knows. Well, why don't you have them create their own, because that's going to be much more meaningful to them if you think that's an important step for them to get to. And then you start to do the extension phase. So you're going to use your favorite strategies that you use to kind of bring in the idea of the theme and communication. So interpersonal interviews, role plays, letters to the editor, blog posts, follow-up videos or readings or more authentic resources. Again, the grammar point should fit in naturally with the theme and the activity. And you'll know whether that grammar point fits or not, because if you can't think of extension activities, then the theme and the grammar might not go together, and next year you might want to revisit that. Some quick suggestions is, don't be afraid to make mistakes with this. Remember, novice students make mistakes all the time. You're a novice with this, and there's a lot of different places this can kind of fall apart a little bit, and that's okay, because you're going to get up and you're going to try it again next time. If for some reason something doesn't go well, the bare minimum is that you just gave your students some more input. You just gave them more readings or more videos or something more with language, so there's not like a lost opportunity there. If you're lost on where to go with it, you can use yourself as an authentic resource. They think we're fascinating. So write a story about yourself, write a story about somebody in your life. Okay, you can be that authentic resource for them. Again, PACE does not work for all grammar points. Think specifically, is there that easy rule that they can figure out based on that resource? Okay. All right.